All right, we are live. Thank you for joining us for my first live stream on this channel of 2021. It was a fascinating year behind us for various reasons, but most importantly for my channel's perspective, the implosion of Islamic apologists, how they all seem to go crazy this past year. Let us hope that that continues and large numbers of people leave Islam in the coming year. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about our plans for the coming year, what we plan to do with our YouTube channels. Then we'll dive into an informal discussion about some of the reasons why we don't find atheism to be a very viable belief system, why we think that it is false and it does not really correspond to objective reality. I have with me today James, the Thunderous One, Anthony Rogers, and Lloyd de Jongh. I'll give them a chance to introduce themselves in a second, but first, let me lead us in a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this time together, and we thank you for the opportunity to connect with people around the world. The internet gives us a great new opportunity to connect with people in far-flung countries. I'm talking with a couple people who don't even live on the same continent as me today, and it allows us to reach into territories and regions where we otherwise would have no access to. This gives unprecedented opportunity for your message, the gospel, to spread throughout the world. We ask that you be with us and guide us today, and that you keep our focus on what is most important, you and your word. We ask that anyone listening today approach the material with an open mind, that they not simply dismiss our arguments because they don't want to believe them, but rather approach the material, think about what we say, and take it into consideration. We ask that you guide our discussion, give us the words to say, and prevent us from theological error. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
All right. So we'll first go to James to introduce himself, because this was kind of his doing. He approached me earlier in this week and he said, would you like to have a get together where we can talk about atheism? So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and why atheism is an important topic to you, and why you wanted to introduce this topic today and how it relates to your plans in the coming year.
Okay, so I'm Thunderous, former Muslim, went through atheism, or evolution, should I say, before I became somebody who accepts the biblical narrative, or the Bible as being truth. My reasons for thinking that atheism is untenable is because when you look at atheism and you look at the history of life, the universe and the world and all that's in there, atheism is basically predicated on evolution. So when you're saying you're an atheist, you are in effect really saying you're an evolutionist. And when you consider questioning evolution at every possible level, at every possible sort of juncture or proposition that it makes, it falls flat on its face. It's one of the, if not the greatest deception of the past 100 years. In that sense, it's untenable. But I find it even more insidious in the way that it's dismantling society and harmony in the community, undermining people's faith in an intelligent designer. And I use the term intelligent designer in the same sense as Discovery Institute, that it's a minimal commitment to theism. That is to say, let's not argue about who God is. Let's accept that there is an intelligent designer. That discussion about who God is can be a separate discussion. But for the sake of this discussion, intelligent designer and the impact that atheism is having now, because with atheism is moving forward, but in its wake, there are other things taking place that are riding in on its crest that are confusing, destroying, undermining people's, not just people's faith in an intelligent designer or whatever intelligent designer that they hold faith in, but also in communities, in education, in places of employment and whatnot. It's an insidious, infectious, and ruining families as well. And because of the tenets of atheism, or what they think are the tenets of atheism, those are the concerns that I have. Hence why my plans for the year, hopefully with yourself, Thaddeus, Mr. T, perhaps to go through the year and discuss each facet of evolution as to why It just does not make sense. And to not only destroy evolution at each one of those levels, but hopefully we'll be able to encourage people to look onto those separate subjects of evolution themselves to, if you like, build up a foundation for their faith in the intelligent designer. That's what I'm hoping to do through the year.
Excellent. I also would like to, I forgot to mention this off the top, but if any of the audience participants have suggestions about what you'd like to see out of my channel, in particular, why my guests are introducing themselves, go ahead and put those in the chat. Next up, we have Anthony. I just watched a theological teaching on the serpent of Genesis on his channel last night. It was an excellent study. I believe he plans to continue his look into messianic prophecies of the Bible. But what else is on your plate for the new year, Anthony?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I have a YouTube page. It's simply under my name, Anthony Rogers. Other people will probably know me from the Acts 17 apologetics page, where I have done videos with David Wood for a number of years. I've also been a longtime contributor to answeringislam.org for at least a decade, with people like David, as well as Sam Shamoon, Al-Fadi, and so forth. I also do things on Al-Fadi's channel, Hatun's channel, your channel sometimes. So people probably have seen me, if they've seen me, on one or another of these channels. As far as the new year, on my own channel, one of the things that I am seeking to do is become more sufficient as far as support goes, so that I can do more stuff on my channel. As you know, Thaddeus, I have several jobs. I am a pastor in South Carolina. I serve in the prisons for Metanoia Prison Ministries. Metanoia is the Greek word for repentance. I don't intend to stop doing that, but I have a night job as well that supplements my income, where I work for a ministry answering theological questions. And I'm hoping to scale back from that just so I can crank out more videos. A number of people on my channel want me to do more stuff. At present, I do a live show every Friday, sometimes also on Sunday evenings. And then I'll try to put out some kind of shorter video during the week. But I'd like to do a whole lot more. I hope to do a bunch of debates this year. I already have one scheduled with a Unitarian named Dale Tuggy. But I'd like to do a lot more debates with Muslims. It's been hard to get Muslims to debate. My last debate was with Shabir. I don't know, what was that, a month and a half or so ago. But prior to Shabir, the last debate I had done was with a unknown Muslim named Adamu Bakari. And that just shows you how slim the pickings are. Muslims talk a good game, but they don't usually come to the table to debate, unless they are, debating somebody they think they have a better chance of routing. In any case, those are some of my hopes for the new year, and Lord willing, we'll see some of that happen.
Excellent. Thank you for that. I would also like to encourage people to support Anthony on Patreon. I would definitely like to see more material out of Anthony. Of the regular guests to Acts 17, he's my favorite. I mean, other people can have other preferences, that's fine. But I'm not just saying that because he's here. I really enjoy his deep theological teachings. That's really the kind of material that I personally enjoy the most. Last up, but certainly not least, Lloyd. This coming week, hopefully, or at least sometime soon for sure, I'll be on your channel for the first time. And I will be talking about the death of Muhammad on your channel. What else do you have in the works?
Thanks for having me on again. I think it's been, a couple of dozen shows at this point. It's been a very fruitful collaboration. It's been fantastic. Thank you again for all the support, and Happy New Year, everyone. And hope you all had a wonderful, wonderful Christmas. On that point, so my channel's been growing. It's been doing very well. And upcoming. So my expertise and what I talk about is Islamic Sharia law. So that is the law, the sacred law of the four major schools of Islam. I discuss those in detail, so the Sharia is the final culmination, is the final product of the understanding of the Quran and the Hadith, and the Sirah, which is then distilled into this final set of very, very detailed laws found across the 4 schools in multiple books. This is one I discuss. One of the shows that I'll be doing on the 14th with an ex-Muslim who became a Christian theologian who spent 3 years at seminary and is currently doing his master's, I think, or his PhD on the Trinity, a man called Shamoon Kakan, an ex-Pakistani Muslim. He and I will be discussing marriage and divorce laws in Islam, and we'll be going in detail through the actual legal system as the laws are described. And you're going to come across the word prepubescent and the word infant a few times, more than just a few times, more than once or twice. The words prepubescent are going to come up a whole lot in terms of marriage in Islam. So you're going to learn a lot about how it's illegal to accuse your wife of adultery, especially if she's an infant. And I'm pretty sure the word infant doesn't mean 21, but that could just be me. And then I also will be talking on Sundays. I do a show with Ask Truth Apologetics. We have an interesting show going on Paul, because I discuss also Islamic polemics. I've studied the major Islamic polemicists, and also so we are doing counter arguments to explain the flaws in their arguments and how to work against those arguments using facts, logic, reason, and history. And so Sundays at 8 p.m. my time in Warsaw in Poland, I do, which is 7 p.m. UK time or GM, Greenwich Mean Time. So we're discussing the Apostle Paul at the moment. I think we'll be doing our 6th show to go in detail through the works of Apostle Paul and how his works are all in perfect alignment with those of the other gospel writers, as well as the words of Jesus. And something else I'm busy is to discuss Islam 101. I'm doing definitions. So Islamic doctrine and dogma, but going through words and what they actually mean and the doctrines that they discuss in detail from the Sharia. So those are things I think that are lacking within discourse on Islam from a Christian apologetics and Christian polemic side. So that's what I will be doing in the next few weeks. So Monday, I do a live stream where I try to do an educational show, and I will be talking about also the Crusades. We'll be talking about the history of the Crusades, the legal definitions of jihad, Demiz, and jizya. So I'll be going through all of those. And once you understand the Sharia, it's inescapable, because it is Islam black and white with the final definitions, the final understanding, the final word and interpretation of Islam. So this is what I do. So yeah, please do support the channel. It's youtube.com/Lloyd de Jongh. My full name, and the surname is de Jongh. And yeah, that's me. Thank you, Thaddeus.
Excellent. As a creator, one of the downsides is you don't have so much time to watch other people's content, but I have seen a good portion of Lloyd's videos on the Apostle Paul. It's a great series. I definitely recommend people check that out. As far as myself goes, Marcus here gave the suggestion that he'd like to see more of my videos on the Quranic scientific miracles. He also said that he'd like to see some live debates on this channel. It's interesting that he likes those videos. I happen to be a fan of those videos. I think they're pretty interesting and they're pretty good, but my audience doesn't seem to think the same thing, because those videos are among the lowest viewed videos on my channel. I definitely do plan to continue the series, but you get that feedback from the number of views and comments and whatnot, and you kind of get a feel for what your audience wants. And it's odd, because it's definitely something that a lot of Muslims care a lot about, but the anti-Muslim crowd, the Christian crowd, doesn't seem to care as much about that particular subject. But like I said, I definitely plan to do some more on those. I'll continue to work through that video from Merciful Servant that I started working through, address their so-called miracles. I'm sure we'll find that they all have perfectly ordinary explanations for how the Quran came to contain the words it contains. That said, the other suggestion about having debates, I'm not personally a huge fan of debates. I don't find them very helpful most of the time, and I don't mean like I don't want to do a debate. I mean, when I watch a debate, I don't usually find it all that interesting, because usually both participants just kind of have their pre-prepared points and they don't really interact with what the other person said. There are exceptions. There are good debates. But, I'm just not a big fan of debate myself. So, I wouldn't definitively rule out that I would have a debate, but it's not high on my agenda. Some things I definitely will be doing in the coming year. A while back, I posted that I wanted to do a video on Muhammad's last sermon, or I should say so-called last sermon, because you see this internet meme where Muhammad supposedly said all these things that sound a lot like racial tolerance in his last sermon. But then you go to the extant text from the ancient sources and you find those words aren't in there. In fact, they derive from 1980 or 1970s book published in India. That seems to be the first time anyone ever knew that Muhammad supposedly said these words. So I'd posted a while ago that I wanted to do a video on that. Someone recently asked me why I hadn't done that video yet, so that I'm definitely moving that one up on my agenda. I still haven't done my video about 5,000, celebrating 5,000 subscribers with a monetary challenge to prove the Quran correct, as I did for 2,500 subscribers, 1,500. So that's definitely high on my agenda as well. And the other video I'm working on in the immediate future, I'm taking a bunch of clips of Yasser Qadhi and kind of interspersing them with his smackdown of David Wood and Jay Smith. And it'll be called Yasser Qadhi Lays the Smackdown on Himself. I'm going to take things he said in that video, such as, talking about people who speak outside of their area of expertise, ultra-crepidarians, and then interposing it with him doing the exact same thing. I have some clips of him talking about Christianity where he sounds like one of those internet conspiracy websites where he's saying like Constantine was largely responsible for inventing Christianity and other ridiculous nonsense like that, and other such things where he kind of undermines his criticisms, if you can even call them that, that he made in that video. So those are my immediate plans. I definitely plan to try to publish more scripted content in the coming year. I'm kind of very particular about the way I edit the videos, which makes them take a long time. But I'm hoping to definitely put more effort into getting out more scripted videos because those tend to do the best. People like short videos for obvious reasons. So that is what I have on my agenda. So we'll go ahead and dive into our main subject for today, which is atheism. I'm going to try to keep a close eye on the comments. Feel free to ask questions about the topic or anything else, since we're kind of just having an informal discussion today. Normally, I wouldn't just take random off-topic questions, but, today we'll take topics on whatever you like. So you can bring your silly objections against Christianity or whatever you like. I will give some of my thoughts, but I'm going to primarily try to pay attention to the comments because it's really hard to do both at the same time, which is why I never do a live stream with just myself. I let my guests do most of the talking. So since you were the one who requested this talk, Thunderous, why don't you get us started with one reason why you think atheism or evolution is not a very good explanation for the way the world is.
Well, what I was going to do to start off, considering all four of us are in agreement that the biblical narrative is truth, was perhaps maybe get the mindset as to where atheism or evolution actually comes from. Because it's not natural for a human being to look at the creation that we have before us and think nothing did it. There must be some kind of driving force behind it. If we can accept that, for instance, the way I read the Bible, I see that the period of time that we're in at the moment as being the last days. We've had 90 minutes. That's if you watch English soccer. I think you guys call it soccer in America. We call it football in England. The 90 minutes are up and we're now in time added on as far as the last days are concerned. If that's the case, and then looking back historically as to when atheism and evolution started, it kind of like, for me, I have to see it from the perspective, well, who's running the planet and where did it come from? So when I look at the biblical narrative, say from Job to Daniel to Matthew to Revelation, Ephesians, 1 John or James or Corinthians, these scriptures show me that Satan and the demons are running the planet. They're the ones in control. They are maneuvering events on the world scene, as it were, gearing up, if you like, to the time of the end. So atheism for me is nothing more than a product or a mindset that originates with the demonic realm that has somehow infiltrated, whatever what means they do, into the minds of people in the past that have promoted it to the point where we are now, where atheism is an accepted norm and evolution is proposed as a scientific reality. And both propositions are totally absurd. Now, I read in the comments earlier on by, is it Marcus Aurelius, who commented that proven evolution wrong does not, by implication, I paraphrase, prove that intelligent design as being true. Well, I'd like Marcus Aurelius to perhaps propose an alternative theory that if evolution is wrong, because there is zero evidence for it, and you're saying that, okay, then because there's zero evidence for evolution, that must mean, well, intelligent design can't be true either. What are you going to propose as a third alternative that has some kind of reality that we can look at and think, wow, yeah, never considered that? Because thus far, the whole history of the world is baying on those one or two opinions. Either there is a God or there isn't. Either everything did nothing, nothing did everything and everything came from nothing, or, to put it so simply, if you like, God did it. What are you going to offer Marcus Aurelius?
To speak to Marcus's point, I think he was partially saying that atheism and evolution are not the same idea, which is technically true. Practically speaking, though, in the modern world, just about anyone who says that they are an atheist will be a naturalist who says that evolution and chance alone, natural laws combined with chance, is the reason for everything you see in the world. So while they are not technically the same, they are practically the same for,
yes,
well over 90% of people who would call themselves atheists, which is, I'm pretty sure is what James is saying. So with that introduction, I'll go to Anthony. What is your top reason for believing that atheism is not a very good explanation for the world?
Yeah, well, before coming to that, I just want to piggyback off something Thunderous said. He mentioned, in his view, we're in the last days. Well, interestingly, and I don't want to get into eschatology here, but there's a sense in which, if that's the criteria for determining the last days, we've been in the last days since the fall, because the whole notion of evolutionary thinking really is essentially pagan thinking and has been from the beginning. Not going all the way back, but going back a good distance, just to give you an illustration of this. If you look at the birth of philosophy with the pre-Socratics, men like Thales, Anaximenes, and Anaximander, you realize that in their thinking, everything ultimately originates from some primal stuff out of which it evolved, right? One like Thales said, everything is water, arises from water. All the diversity that we see arises from some primal substance, in his case, water. Others said it was earth. Others said fire. Others said apeiron, which was just a way of not saying what it was, but that it was something. And but this is true even of, now, a lot of people mistake words and they confuse what those words really mean in these systems. And so they might conclude that these ancient philosophers were believers in God because they use the term God, they use the term gods, but in their system, even the gods originated from this primal stuff, if you will. The gods themselves are birthed out of this and through the combinations that result from the differentiation that takes place as time goes on. And so really there are two ultimately contrasting systems when you think about it. There's the theistic approach to things that says everything is something other than God, created by God, subject to the sovereign control of God, and a system which says, no, there is nothing other than reality, and everything originates in some sense, even the gods as well as men and things, from this more basic stuff, inert matter, however you want to describe it. And so I really think that what you have are two ultimate perspectives, two diametrically opposed ways of looking at reality, and it's really ancient. Now the difference is that with Darwin, it received a scientific veneer, right? Prior to Darwin, it just appeared to be philosophical or religio-philosophical speculation. But with Darwin and his proposal of a mechanism, namely, survival of the fittest and so forth, it got a scientific veneer. Now, anybody who studied science, though, knows that Darwin's mechanism has fallen on hard times, right? Not that scientists who are committed to evolution have rejected the notion of evolution, but Darwin's mechanism is no longer considered sufficient to do the job that Darwin thought it could do. And that's because of a number of reasons that I won't mention right now. But so as far as why I'm not an atheist, I don't think I can fully plumb the depths of this very briefly right here. But I would say when you recognize that there are these two ultimate perspectives, and as a Christian, I would say that the theistic perspective is specifically a Christian theistic perspective. That's the only truly adequate theistic notion that there is. All others being either aping Christianity like Islam. It ends up being incoherent and self-contradictory and so forth. But when you look at the world in light of these two ultimate perspectives, it's only the Christian theistic system in terms of which anything can be made intelligible. On an atheist perspective, everything reduces to nonsense, right? Everything reduces to absurdity. And, I think that there is a lot that can be said, regarding the evidence for God. I think there's a lot that can be said regarding arguments and proofs that can be offered for God. But I think that the most basic thing that I would want to say is that really, if you don't believe in a sovereign God who created the world, who governs the world in accordance with his own rational character, who made man in his image so that man is tailored to the world, his environment, the world is a place that is intelligible, and man himself is a being capable of making sense out of things. That to me is the fundamental issue, right? On atheism, everything reduces to absurdity. Man himself is an absurdity, and he's certainly not a being capable of understanding a world that's capable of being understood. Now, maybe I'll have some time to explicate that a bit more, but I don't want to hog the mic, so I'll pass it on.
Excellent. What are your opening thoughts, Lloyd? Why do you find atheism to be not particularly appealing or viable?
There was a period in my life that I was, shall I say, things went bad, and I was beset with doubts. And I think there's like when you're in a state of doubt, you don't know which way to turn. You lose your grasp on things. You become unsure of things, and I realized that leaves you in a state of weakness where you search for anything, you grasp for anything that can give you some kind of certainty. And once things improved, I started to think about that, and I realized that was a very bad reason for denying God. That's a very bad reason for accepting that what is really a very empty set of beliefs is a way to live my life. And I also found that many of the people that I met had no good reasons for not accepting God, for not wanting to be religious. I grew up in the church, and I saw many happy people in the church, and I saw many atheists who were just finding a way to free themselves from any sort of moral restraints. And what's interesting and I also started to listen to the actual arguments presented, and many of them, once I started to really deeply research them, as you know, I get a little OCD when it comes to research, were very empty. Like, for instance, I believe in science. Well, science is a method. It's a process. It's not a belief system. And okay, so I believe in test tubes, and so that for me was very empty. And then something that really triggered me was the movie Zeitgeist. I was one of the very first people to order that movie. I mean, literally probably the first dozen to get a copy of that thing, to order it, and I watched it and I believed it. And then afterwards, I started doing some research on his claims. In fact, I want to do a show in the next few weeks on the claims about Jesus being an amalgamation of former gods, apparently. Like for instance, if I look at so he's apparently Horus, for instance. When you look to the claims they make about Horus and how Jesus is a copycat of Horus, and you actually look at Horus and Isis, and you realize that the person who created Zeitgeist had no idea what he was talking about. Either he was incredibly ignorant or he was incredibly dishonest. And you realize that why would they need to lie to that degree? To push an idea, and you realize it's really they simply want to be, at least I felt, they wanted to be free of moral restraints to do what they wanted. And it was more denial of God. And atheists also felt were not, atheism is the belief that your beliefs are not a belief. That's the definition I've come to. And it's really not a rational point that there isn't a God. It's usually atheists are anti-theist, anti-Christian, for that matter. They're trying to impose will. They're not trying to find logos. And if you're looking for truth, then why be so dishonest? And those were some of the questions. I mean, I had a real sort of existential crisis, I guess, back in the day, but it's something I got past. And I also have had some spiritual experiences that led me to believe that yes, there is a God. He loves the world. He loves us. He cares about us. And there were some really good answers given by really wise theologians who talk about morality, the problem of pain, the problem of suffering, and all these things, and they make sense to me. So these are maybe not profound, but these are some of my thoughts and some of the things that led me down the path to where I am.
Can I just touch on something that Lloyd said there? He said something very interesting. I don't mean to interrupt, but
sure,
Lloyd,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Lloyd said something interesting about watching the movie Zeitgeist, and if I remember watching that when it first came out as well. It's split in three components. The first part is about Jesus and his life. Of course, it's basically based on myths of previous religions and faiths and alternative realities, as it were, that were combined, and that's where you get the narrative of Jesus from. Then the second component was about the currency, the banking system of America, and the monster from Jekyll Island of 1913. And then the third component of Zeitgeist was the conspiracy behind 911, and that the narrative we've been sold on 911 is not a reality, but there's an alternative reality that has more science and logic based to it. What I thought about that was, I thought that the producers of Zeitgeist were quite clever, and I thought that the whole point of that was an attack on the Bible, because the other two components were so convincing and evidence-based, like the discussion of Jekyll Island. And you can't deny, we're not here to talk about conspiracies or whatever, but the point is, even the second argument was so plausible, convincing, and it has reality to it and historical reference points. The same thing with 911. Buildings don't just collapse in free fall, and show me an airplane hitting the Pentagon or any evidence of a plane, then I'll believe you. But up until then, no airplane, no Pentagon being hit, 911. Not by an airplane anyway. So the point is, if you believe the second and third component, your natural inclination is, well, the first component of that Zeitgeist must be true as well. So I thought it was interesting. It started off with an attack on Jesus and then went straight to America from 1913, then 2001. So what was the point? So the point for me was, let's undermine the faith of those who have a faith in the biblical narrative about Jesus, because he couldn't be lying, because the second part was true and the third part was true. So the conclusion must be that the first part was true as well.
Yeah, I'm actually hoping to do a show on the Zeitgeist discussion about atheism, because on Jesus, because it's completely false, and so he just blatantly lied, and that's something I hope to seriously look at every single claim he makes and debunk it.
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought up that movie. It's a different conspiracy than the one I alluded to earlier, but it's along the same lines that atheism sells itself as this very intellectual system, and I'm not saying there aren't intellectual atheists, certainly there are, But then at the same time, you get people accepting these ridiculous conspiracy theories. Either, Constantine made Jesus into God in the year 323, and that before that, no one knew anything about Jesus, and it was totally just invented at the Council of Nicaea. And you got plenty of atheists seriously posting that stuff. I mean, either they're blatantly lying or they actually believe it, and I think in many cases they actually believe it, but it's totally contrary to history. Or you got these narratives about how Christianity is a copy of pagan religions, and how all the gods in all of history were all apparently born on December 25th, for example, even though there's no evidence that any of these gods were ever claimed to have a December 25th birthday. The claim is constantly made that they're all born on that particular day. Not that that's an important aspect of Christianity, of course. In fact, Jesus probably was not born on December 25th. We just happened to celebrate Christmas on that particular day. But we don't do so because we copied it from some pagan religion. So it's very interesting that atheism sells itself on this very intellectual system, but then many atheists, certainly not all, but many atheists buy into conspiracy nonsense. And same with religious systems. Many religious people buy into complete conspiracy nonsense. I'm not saying it's unique to atheism. I'm just saying that people's beliefs aren't necessarily based on rational choices the vast majority of the time, and atheism is no exception to that. That's not an argument against atheism, just a comment I wanted to make.
If I can add to what I've said, if I may, Thunderous, 1 second. Also, a couple of other things. I live now in the former Soviet bloc and met lots of people who hated communism, who grew up under communism. And unfortunately, you see communism spreading in the West. And my country, South Africa, America, you actually see the signs of it growing. But that aside, you hear the term scientific atheism, and you realize that was a term invented by Marx and Lenin, who went on to murder, anywhere between 100 and 200 million people last century. So atheism allowed them to, without any moral scruples, to go ahead and murder that many people. And also you realize that atheism is an integral component of communism, which was the most barbarous ideology of the last 150, 200 years. And atheists refuse to accept any responsibility for the fact that their ideology, if it doesn't overtly cause the violence or promote the violence, it certainly has no moral stand against it. So it certainly allows it. There's no moral compunction against it. So what's wrong with killing 200 million people? So atheists love to blame Christians. For instance, you guys did the Crusades, which is very ahistorical, but that's a longer discussion from the time. But they refuse to assume any responsibility for atheism's role in the pogroms, the horrendous genocides of communism. And scientific atheism, as I said, is a term that comes from these murderous communists, and they embrace it as if it's some kind of good thing. And then also the idea of the religious wars. When they talk about that, and you go and research it, you realize communism in the last 150 years has been the most murderous ideology. Islam certainly takes the cake, right? As the all-time winner in terms of violence, but communism has been horrifically violent, caused huge death and destruction. Even Nazism, which is a form of communism, pales in comparison to general communism. And then you look at the research, you actually break down the number of wars, communism versus Christianity, and you realize that religious wars make up a tiny, tiny fraction, a few percent. And Islam is the bulk of that, for that matter. And then 90-something% of all wars are basically, unrelated to religion. So and they refuse to want to look at that. They try to whitewash themselves of any blame or responsibility.
Yeah, this kind of actually relates to this question I put up on the screen from Erican. What's your take on non-theistic religions? And I say it relates because earlier in the comments a while back, Marcus Aurelius, who, by the way, in a previous chat called himself the friendly atheist, and I really appreciate him being here today. But in any case, Marcus said something along the lines of atheists don't usually attempt to defend atheism, they just critique religion, which I agree with. Atheists the vast majority of atheist arguments I see are X doesn't make sense in Christianity usually, or X doesn't make sense in religion, therefore atheism is true, or therefore you shouldn't believe in theism, which by implication means atheism is true. But then we also have non-theistic religions, as Erkin points out. Something like Buddhism. Some Buddhists would say there's a God, so others would say there is no God, that the universe is a self-sufficient system, or that the physical universe we know about, that we think we know about, isn't even a real thing, that's just in your mind, and you need to follow these particular practices to become an enlightened person, to free yourself from this state of being, and that has nothing at all to do with the belief in God. So I think that for me to embrace atheism, I would need to see positive arguments for it, not just arguments that say, well, this doesn't make sense in your belief system. Likewise, for me to accept Christianity, I need more than just hear some argument, or theism in general. I need more than just some arguments that, this is a problem with atheism. And I think both sides of this divide, people tend to only look at problems on the other side and ignore all the problems on their side. But I think, for the select few who actually look at all the evidence, my opinion is obviously that the evidence is strongly in favor of theism. That doesn't mean there aren't any questions that are difficult for theists to answer, but I think that the theist offers a lot more and better explanations for the state of the world than atheism does. Do you guys have any thoughts on this question about non-theistic religions?
Ironically, Buddha was an atheist, and now people worship him.
Yeah, one thing I'd say about Buddhism, I grew up in Southern California. At the time, there was an influx of people from a Vietnamese background because of the war and so forth. But that meant that I had a good bit of interaction with Buddhist ideas, at least the form of Buddhism that they practiced. And after that, I started reading all sorts of other things on Buddhism. But if you just take a very standard view of Buddhism, which says that all is one, right? This very much is similar to what I was saying is true of the pre-Socratics, and why I said that a lot of this thought is ancient, and the whole and it ties in with evolution and so forth. But the idea that reality is one and all distinction is illusory is a perfect example of what I mean when I say that this reduces everything to absurdity. I was I can illustrate this by a conversation I once had with a Buddhist. We were talking, and I remember asking him what his view of reality is, what his view of man is, how should we live our lives, where is everything going? And he gave me the basic Buddhist spiel. He told me all is one. A lot of our problems arise from making distinctions when distinctions are really illusory. And our ultimate goal is to realize our ultimate identity in the one, right? So you've all heard the famous joke of the man who went to the Buddhist hot dog vendor, right? And he said, make me one with everything, right? You've all heard that. Well, so I started telling this guy, I said, okay, I've heard you. Now let me explain to you what I believe as a Christian. I told him that God made the world. He made it in accordance with his own rational character. He governs it. He made it with wisdom and governs it by that same wisdom. He made man in his image. Man, therefore, is obligated to worship and serve God. Man's highest goal is to glorify and enjoy him, and so on and so forth. And as I was talking about this, the guy began to get very uncomfortable, because this also has implications for, what does this mean for somebody who hasn't been living that way? And, where am I going? And so forth. And he got pretty upset, and he started calling me names, right? And I won't repeat them. But I said, wait a minute. I said, let's remember our two perspectives. Okay. I said, on your approach to reality, all is one. There are no distinctions. So everything you're now saying about me, you're ultimately saying about yourself. Remember, there are no distinctions, right? So if I am an idiot, a jerk, and all the rest, then by necessary, implication, that all those things are true of you. And anyways, we kept going on this line of thought for a little bit until he got so uncomfortable that he wanted to leave. And so he left. We were at a friend's house, and he left, and he started to go across the street. And I said, why are you looking both ways before crossing the street? Right. In other words, one way and then the other way. And the point that I was making, and I didn't give you the whole conversation we were having, is this man is necessarily living in terms of distinctions. He can't avoid it. He has to make these distinctions. There's a distinction between himself and the street, a distinction between this side and the other side of the street, a distinction between left and right. And because he doesn't want to be made one with the street, he's making sure there's no cars coming, right? But if he were acting consistently with his essentially atheistic philosophy of life, there are no distinctions, certainly not a distinction between God the creator and the creation. But he can't live consistently with that. And so he's acting as if the world were not the sort of thing that his philosophy describes, but actually the sort of place that the Christian says it is, right? So again, I mean, this is just sort of an illustration of what I mean when I say that if you don't take a Christian approach to things, then you necessarily have to be inconsistent if anything's going to be intelligible. You're going to have to act like a Christian in order to function and get along in the world.
Excellent thoughts. Ravi Zacharias always would say that even in India, we look both ways before we cross the street. But in response to this idea that contradictions can be true, that both two contradictory ideas can both be true at the same time, and then he followed that by saying, "But it's either the car or your body. It's not both at the same time." And we believe that even in India. Any other thoughts on non-theistic religions?
I just wanted to go back to something that you said a little while ago, Thaddeus, about intellectual, and that's a danger as well, where atheism, evolution, and some of these non-theistic religions, they tend to try desperately to intellectualize what they believe or what they're proposing. And that's the kind of deception in itself, because you want to bear in mind that Satan and the demons about 6,000 years of practice and history and training on understanding how fallen man works. They're the masters of this. That's shown us. And yet the Bible actually quite warns us against this flattering, ego projecting, intellectual understanding and the distinctive way that it works. I mean, in 1 Corinthians 1:18, I'll just paraphrase these verses. It says in 1 Corinthians 1:18 that the torture stake or the crucifixion in some translations is foolishness to those who are perishing. Well, is that not what we find with these people? For them, Christ is, some people, they don't even believe that Christ existed. Never mind that Christ is based on the load of fairy stories. They actually don't believe he existed, and he died. There is no sin in effect. So to them, Jesus dying is foolishness. And then if you go to Colossians 2:8, it talks about philosophy being an empty deception. Ephesians 5:6 talks about not being fooled by empty words. Hebrews 13:9, not being fooled by strange teachings. Or 2 Peter, which is one of my favorites, 3:5, that they deliberately ignore the evidence for the flood. I'm not finding this now in the world that we're living in, that the world seems to be very much what the scriptures warned us about. It tries to intellectualize things so as to sound sophisticated, and therefore, flattering your ego if you understand it because it's intellectual. Therefore, if you understand it, that by identification means you're an intellectual person, and then moving on, whilst it's doing it, flattering your ego, it's undermining the Bible by saying, well, the torture stake, that's foolishness. The flood, that's a joke. Do we not see this is exactly what the Bible warned us about is going to take place? So there has to be a counter towards this in order to draw people back, because when they start going to colleges and universities, this is the very material that they're going to be exposed to undermine that faith in the very things that we know are true.
Yeah, I think you were breaking up a little at the beginning there, but it got better towards the end. So I think I got the gist of what you're saying, and certainly that. I think basically there was kind of 2 points. One is that kind of this idea that what man considers very high intellect is foolishness to God, and what man considers foolish it could be something very profound in the eyes of God. Of course, prime example being that Jesus died on the cross. What do you mean you're founding a religion based on a man who was crucified as a criminal and died? That doesn't make any sense at all. And of course, that was a major stumbling block for the early Romans, that this was the most disgraceful thing that could happen to someone, is being crucified. And yet here Christianity is basing its religion on this fact. And but we can now kind of see how that is profound. That this gives us a strong historical argument that this is something that really happened, and we need an explanation for why Christians would found a religion based on a man who was crucified. And I think going into all the historical evidence would take quite some time, but I've done this exercise, and I think when you look at the historical evidence, by far the best explanation for the data is that Jesus really rose from the dead. And once you're at that point, then it's like, anything else in Christianity, anything that might be somewhat difficult to explain, I still need an explanation for it, don't get me wrong, but in comparison, if I know that Jesus rose from the dead, then I pretty much know that Christianity is true. And then your other point was that the church needs to do a much better job of educating the youth, and I think that is certainly true. When atheism began to rise in the 18th century, when the quote unquote scientific criticism of the Bible was a new thing, and it was starting to filter down to the public, the church didn't yet have any answers to these questions, and they kind of retreated into this position where, well, I believe so. It doesn't matter. It was kind of a defense mechanism at the time, but it has not served the church well, and it will not serve the church well going forward. We need to do a better job of exposing, the youth to the evidence for Christianity, not just having this, you should believe, and if you don't believe, well, you can leave the church, which is, not every church, of course, but a lot of churches, that's kind of all they offer. It's like, here's our doctrine. If you like it, great. We welcome you. If you don't like it, well, oh well. So I also have on this question up on the screen on how you gain knowledge. This is, of course, the study of epistemology. So if you guys want to comment on anything that I said or Thunderous said, or on this question, that'd be great.
Well, I don't hear anyone else, so I'll say something. My approach to knowledge, you have in the history of philosophy 2 or 3 basic approaches, right? There's all sorts of variation within these that we can talk about, but just in terms of basic approaches, you have the empiricist approach, which says that all knowledge is ultimately empirical in nature, observational by means of our senses, right? Our sights, smell, hearing, and so forth. Then you have, in contrast to that, the rationalist approach, which says that knowledge begins with certain indubitable notions and extends out from there. So you had people like Descartes and others advocating something along these lines. You have elements of this in earlier philosophers, where Plato taught that knowledge is essentially recollection, right? We originally existed in the realm of the forms where we had direct access to things, and now through our contact with the instantiations in this world, we're being reminded of the forms, right? So in a sense, he was advocating a kind of rationalism. And I realize some people may not fully understand some of what I'm saying, but I hope you understand at least the basic point, that there are those who say that all knowledge is based on observation, others that would say that knowledge is essentially, it's propositional in nature, intellectual ideal in nature, and so forth. And then you would have those who would be more mystical, right? Knowledge comes through some kind of experiential feeling or something along those lines. In my view, none of these views are adequate. And actually, the history of philosophy bears this out. All of these approaches to knowledge have ended up in skepticism. So, for example, the British empiricists ended in skepticism. People like David Hume, Bertrand Russell, basically said that, we can't really know anything, right? I don't know how much you want me to delve into this, but just very briefly, I'll give you an example of what I mean. If you say that to learn anything by experience, you have to be able to make inferences from observed cases to unobserved cases, right? You have to be able, for example, if I say that fire burns, I'm inferring that from past experience. I touched fire, it burned me. Now, how many times did I do that before I concluded that fire burns? Right? Hopefully only a couple of times, right? And then I said, I don't want to touch fire anymore. But notice the incredible leap that involves. From a couple of experiences of a flame, I inferred that all fire burns, so that I never want to touch fire, no matter how many times I encounter it, right? You're making this huge leap. And what it assumes, according to everyone, and what Russell and Hume observed, what this assumes is what's called the uniformity of nature, that nature is uniform. What's true in particular cases can be generalized to all cases. But what is the basis for our belief that unobserved cases and future cases are like observed cases in the past? Okay, we don't have an observation that nature is uniform. Okay, our ability to know anything from experience assumes that nature is uniform. Okay, it's not something we know empirically. So empiricism is necessarily out the window. We don't have any foundation for our belief in the uniformity of nature, which empiricism rests on, right? If we're empiricists. And I won't do the same thing with respect to rationalism, but it's the same sort of thing. It ends up undermining itself. And so what I would say is that ultimately we need something back of both of these that grounds them and makes them possible. And so ultimately what I'm talking about is revelation. I would advocate a revelational epistemology. The reason we can use our senses and assume something like the uniformity of nature is precisely because we know the world is governed by a sovereign God who made the world, who upholds and governs the world in accordance with his plan and so forth. We have statements in scripture like Genesis 9, where it says, as long as the earth remains, seed time and harvest, summer and winter will continue, and so forth. That's a statement of uniformity, right? You have God talking about, setting, God being the one who put things in motion, who set things in order, who governs the stars, who numbers the stars, calls them by name. On and on we could go, especially in the Psalms where it uses this sort of language. So as a Christian, we can approach the world using our senses precisely because we know that this is a world that was created and governed by God. And by the way, when you look at something like science, this was all grounded in this way of thinking. No other culture on the planet came up with science, right? And this isn't just my claim. You can find this out by reading numerous scholars of the history of science. Stanley Jackie, Rodney Stark, numerous scholars point out that science itself was born in a Christian cultural milieu because Christians believed that the world was subject to the control of a personal God and therefore was orderly, and man was made in his image and therefore able to learn things by looking at the world and discovering and discerning things. But other cultures didn't have this perspective. And so you don't find science in other cultures. It was a Christian phenomena. And that's why, again, going back to evolution, that's why evolution is such a strange thing, because it's supposedly a product of science, but science itself as a discipline is a product of Christianity. So really, to the extent that science has, run after evolution, science is playing the prodigal, right? Science is a prodigal of Christianity that's now run off and is feeding at the swine trough of evolutionism. But not to keep going, but I would say that we need a revelational approach to knowledge undergirding things like our empirical tools, our rational tools, and things like that. Otherwise, these things don't really produce knowledge. We have no basis for believing that our senses give us knowledge if we don't have a basis for believing in something like the uniformity of nature. Does that mean you want me to keep going?
Yes, I had muted myself and forgot. I'm going to assume that the other two guests don't have anything they want to say on this subject, but I did want to say one thing. This idea of knowledge actually is kind of a pretty good argument against atheism. This is called the evolutionary argument against atheism by Alvin Plantinga. I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with that. I imagine Anthony might be, but basically the idea is this, that if evolutionary theory is true, then we evolved to meet certain basic needs, how to get the most food, how to find a mate, stuff like that. So we have no reason to believe that that evolution would cause us to have thoughts that correspond with reality, that other than that basic level where they are based on survival needs. Indeed, from the atheist perspective, we know if atheism is true, then we know for a fact that it produces false beliefs, because throughout human history people have believed in a God. So the two are incompatible to an extent, that atheism doesn't produce or doesn't incentivize rational thought that corresponds with with reality on higher questions that have no survival benefit. So the two taking place at the same time, both being true, the probability of both being true at the same time is inherently low, since it would just have to be by random chance that your thoughts corresponded with reality when it comes to high complex rational ideas.
I think I would like to add on that as well, that knowledge, for me, when I look to that question, you see, you can look at, say, something of, say, a dinosaur, the fossilized remains of a dinosaur. Now, that's knowledge for a theist and an evolutionist. But your power of perception is then used as to, well, how did that come about to be? What's the evidence? What's the logical trail as to how we've got where dinosaurs came from, what happened to them, and where we are now? That would be where the power of perception comes in. Knowledge is there for everyone to take. It's how you use that knowledge and how you perceive where it leads you. Because Romans 1:20 is quite clear in that, for his invisible qualities are clearly seen from the world's creation onward. And there are several translations that use the term, for they're perceived by the things made. So his eternal power and Godship are inexcusable. And that's an interesting point, because when you use your power of perception, and the Apostle Paul's making it quite clear, the evidence abounds that there is no reason, no excuse at all for anybody to come to any other conclusion based on the evidence, based on knowledge, to come to the conclusion that there is an intelligent designer. There is simply no excuse to come up with an alternative possible theory. It's just pseudoscientific claptrap at every stage in the evolutionary model. Apostle Paul makes that quite clear in Romans 1:20.
Yeah, when we look at the universe, we see that it's very complex, not even looking at life, but just at the universe itself. And we're to the point where we can make sophisticated models of what a theoretical universe would look like. And we know that all of these variables have to be in very small, tight constraints. And then we look at life, and we know that life, even the simplest life, is incredibly complex. It would have taken a very freak chance event. And then the atheist looks at this evidence and they say, well, we're here, so it happened. It doesn't matter how improbable it is. That doesn't count as evidence for God. And then, I kind of just think in response, well, what would count as evidence then? If something's extremely improbable in your worldview and you can just dismiss it as, well, I know my worldview is true, so it happened, then I think you're probably not really open to evidence.
Just can I give an example of knowledge, evidence, and perception?
Yes.
Okay, so we have dinosaur fossil remains. That's a fact. Now, the theist and the evolutionist will conclude, yes, we do. The evolutionists come up with some kind of high theory that has zero water. The Earth is 2/3 water. If the polar caps melt, that is less land, more water covering the Earth. If the water increases in its temperature by 1 degree, it expands. So that's less land, more water still. And when you look at the remains of Antarctica underneath the ice, it is now known that what was there was a plush paradise, tropical conditions. They found the foliage and such of those remains there. Now, the power of perception for a theist would be water, water, water. The dinosaurs all died in one go. If the polar caps melt, that's less land, more water. And underneath the southern Antarctic polar cap, there is land with vegetation existing underneath it. For a theist, they'll just conclude that's a worldwide flood, the evidence for the worldwide flood. That would be using the power of perception.
You broke up a little at the beginning there, but I think we got the gist of it, talking about how you'll find an explanation for whatever evidence you find that tends to fit your worldview. If you have this preconceived notion that life must have arisen by evolution, then whatever evidence is presented, you'll find some explanation for that. I wanted to go to this comment since it was a super chat, and thank you very much for the super chat, Nicholas Paulson. Please elaborate more on the arguments against atheists that think there's a war between Christianity and science. Also talk about Galileo and the heliocentric world. And I'll throw that one to Anthony since he started talking about the how science arose.
Me and my big mouth. Well, I'll be, well, I don't want to be too brief here. He gave you a super chat. But so let me say, number one, with respect to Galileo, of course, was a Christian. He didn't think he was doing anything other than being a Christian, engaging the world and so forth. And the opposition that arose between what he was proposing and what was ecclesiastically accepted, the contrast was not, Galileo saying this is what science says and the church is saying this is what scripture says. That's often how it's portrayed. But really, the Western church at the time was in the grips of Aristotle. It had come to, basically make Aristotle its, all-controlling, teacher. And you can see this, well, I won't go down some of this, but because philosophers like Aristotle taught that the earth was the center, everything else rotated around it, the church considered this, because of its commitment to Aristotle, to be the sort of orthodox position. So it was ultimately heresy against the teachings of Aristotle more so than against the teaching of the church. And then you would get people in an attempt to sort of, force this point who would try and get scripture to support Aristotle. But notice, that this is the tail wagging the dog, right? Aristotle is here ultimately being taken as determinative for how we approach and read scripture. So that's one thing to be said with respect to the whole Galileo affair. Although it's interesting, I did hear a Roman Catholic scholar the other day arguing that the Earth is the center of the universe. I thought that was interesting. I didn't know there were any left, but there apparently are. But as far as warfare between Christianity and science, one thing I would encourage people to do is to think, although we sometimes, and I did just a moment ago, speak as if science is this monolithic thing, we have to remember that there is not something out there called science, right? We're reifying it. We're acting as though there's this thing out there called science and it's opposed to this thing called Christianity. No, there are scientists. There are people who call themselves scientists, who employ the scientific method, engage in what we call science. But they are not monolithic. There are Christians who are scientists. There are non-Christians who are scientists, which means there are those who do science from a Christian perspective, and there are those who do science from a non-Christian perspective. And just to be even more precise here, I would say there are also Christians who do science from a non-Christian perspective. I think there are Christians who compromise and capitulate to non-Christian thought, not necessarily self-consciously, but they do work in terms of unchristian or non-Christian assumptions. And so even though they are by profession Christians, they're functioning or acting like non-Christians in how they're doing science. But really, if there is a warfare, it's a warfare between those who are doing science from a Christian perspective and those who are doing science from a non-Christian perspective. There's no thing out there called science that is either for or against Christianity. It's individuals who are doing this. And everybody has a worldview in terms of which they think and reason. I think this was part of the point that Thunderous was getting at a moment ago, that we share all the facts in common, right? It's not like I live in a different world than the unbeliever does. We share the same facts. So we all have to recognize that in some sense, the facts don't speak for themselves, meaning that, everybody is interpreting the facts. And so the question is, which worldview should be used when we're interpreting the facts, right? Do we interpret it in light of, go back to the illustration I gave of the Buddhist fellow. Do we interpret the world like a Buddhist who says all is one, or do we interpret it more in a Christian sense? And if we interpret the world more in a Buddhist fashion, can we live consistently with that, right? Remember, the Buddhist couldn't live consistently with that. He had to constantly live and act as if the world were a different sort of place than the one he thought or said he was living in. And I would say that scientists have to do that all the time. They have to constantly forget their worldview in order to, even get along in science. So I'll just leave it with that and hand it over to somebody else if they want to say.
Perhaps I can add something there in that there's been a concerted attack on Christianity for centuries, obviously, and it certainly increased during the golden scientific era, I guess, if you could say, when it started with Darwin. But Christians believe that if God is logos, then God is logical, then God is reason, and therefore the world is reasonable. It has rules that can be discerned, and we are meant to use our minds to try and define those rules. And also we have to be strictly adherent to the truth, because logos is truth, logos is logic. And therefore, the idea of logic comes out of Christian belief. And also Christian, if you look at the history of the Christian church, they started the tradition of schools and universities. Those are institutions that ultimately are born out of Christian institutions. And now you have the idea of atheists who are trying to corrupt this idea, I would say. And this is actually not the case. And if you look at the long list of luminaries in science who were Christians, who felt that because there is order in the world, the order can be discerned, and thus they put their minds to trying to discern this order and then create science in that way. You could just take someone like Isaac Newton as one example, and there are numerous videos you can go and look at and see that Christian thought is scientific thought, is logical thought, and the idea that we are irrational is simply not true. It's simply an assertion by anti-theists. Because in my experience, I've come across few true atheists. I've come across anti-theists, and most specifically anti-Christian theists.
Excellent. You both kind of touched on this idea how atheists often have to borrow from the Christian worldview, and they don't necessarily realize they're borrowing, because they probably grew up in a Christian world and absorbed these ideas, but they have to borrow from Christian ideas, such as the universe being consistent, in order to make their arguments. And they have presuppositions in their arguments that they don't even realize come specifically from Christianity, that other religions don't necessarily agree with those points, and then their arguments wouldn't make any sense, so they turn out to just be anti-Christian arguments. There's been several comments in the chat recently about this one is illustrative here, that most religious people treat irreligion as if it were a single religion, and that's certainly a valid comment. There certainly is a diversity in thought in non-believers. Ironically, atheists are very like hardcore atheists are very quick to make the same error when they want to claim that atheism is on the rise, because they take all the people who identify as atheist or agnostic, or just say they don't believe in any particular religion, and they lump them all together as if they're the same thing. But those are in fact very different things. Indeed, a lot of people who say they don't believe in any specific religion just means they don't want to identify with an organized religion, but they still have spiritual beliefs that act like everyone who's not a theist is exactly the same. It is definitely an error, but I think it's an error that atheists are also guilty of. I think I should have said this at the start, but just to be clear, when we're talking about atheism, we're defining that as the positive belief that there is no God, as opposed to, I don't know if there's a God, or I know Christianity is false, but I don't really have any opinions beyond that, or, I just don't really think about these things. It doesn't impact my life. This kind of practical atheism, which may or may not also be intellectual. What we're talking about is, this positive belief that there is no God behind the universe, that everything, it just happened by chance, and that's what we mean.
Yeah.
So,
if I may add,
yep, go ahead.
I'll step into. I need to formulate an argument in terms of atheism, but in terms of Islam, there's a considerable difference in the mindset, in the worldview within Islam and Christianity. Christianity, we believe that God is logos. God is logical. He is reason. The world is reasonable. We can discern this reason. Islam is will. God can do anything. God is able to do contradictories, whereas, of course, in the Christian worldview, God cannot do contradictories. God cannot lie. God cannot be evil. Whereas in Islam, God can, because to say that God cannot is to limit God. So therefore, this is really a deviation from reason. And I would think that if I had to think this through more carefully, I would be able to find, if you look at the communist worldview, the socialist worldview, and I'm going to lump those two into the same category, because communism is the end result of socialism. Socialism is the state we have now, and communism is the end goal they all strive for, right? So, and you've got consensus. You have the idea of the party. So you have this just like in Islam, there's the ijma, the consensus of the scholars that defines truth, as you did in your excellent video. But the same token, if you look at the communists, and those are all atheists, those are scientific atheists. They use the term scientific atheists. Atheists need to accept that you're all part of the same family, that they all accept the worldview. So if the Communist Party says that this is how it is, then they have to accept how that is. So again, this is a denial of reality, a rejection of logos, and accepting of a human perspective or human ideology, shall we say. I'm not sure the right word to use, but here you've got a narrative that you have to believe. And so the idea of narrative versus the idea of logos, these are vastly different things. And so in this case, Islam and atheism have a very similar, at least communist atheism and atheism is atheism, they have a very similar, strong overlap in terms of their worldview, which is a violation of logos.
So I put this comment up on the screen from Isaac Anderson. His first comment said that he is a ex-pastor atheist. First of all, I wanted to say thank you for joining in today. I'm glad you're here. If you're ex-pastor, we're probably not going to say anything that's going to convince you that Christianity is true, but I'm still glad that you're here. He says that, are you really using the argumentation of borrowing your worldview? Oh my gosh, that's been refuted so many times, which is very interesting, because his original comment after introducing himself, which I wanted to put up on the screen, but it scrolled past before I got a chance to get to it, was that he doesn't believe in Christianity because of lack of evidence and because it has no answers to free will, good, the problem of good, and the problem of evil, which I find especially interesting given that you're saying that you're not borrowing from a Christian worldview. I would like to know what in atheism, I'm going to assume naturalism, allows you to say something is good or evil. Unless you're using those terms in a non-absolute sense, you're not using them the way a Christian would use them, as in actual good and actual evil. You're just using it something like biological preference or something like that. Any thoughts on this idea that you can't have objective good or objective evil outside of a theist system?
Let me throw in here that well, first of all, just as stated, and I realize it's a chat comment, and that means it's limited because of the medium, but this obviously isn't an argument, right? Saying it's been refuted, right? We do that sort of thing all day long. Atheism's been refuted. We could have ended the broadcast doing something like that, right? But when he says it's been refuted, I'd love to know where. I know that atheists have tried to respond to this. I'd certainly grant that. I remember back in the day, atheist philosopher Michael Martin, who wrote a massive book on atheism. It's called Atheism, A Philosophical Justification. And he was probably one of the brighter atheists out there, certainly back in those days. And I don't know where he's at today, but I say that just to make this observation. A lot of the people that are being listened to today really don't even compare to Michael Martin, right? You've got people chasing after Dawkins, Harris, Hitchens, right? Three of the so-called four horsemen. Daniel Dennett's better than the others, but none of them, I think, hold a candle to Michael Martin. But in any case, Michael Martin tried to respond to this sort of thing, and having reviewed all of that, I'd have to say Michael Martin took the drubbing in that whole conversation. But I'm just throwing that out there as one person who did try it. I'm not denying that somebody has tried, but essentially the kind of argumentation, if you want to get into the into this in some greater detail, the kind of argumentation involved when we say that others are borrowing from the Christian worldview is known as transcendental argumentation. Right? You have in logic, you have deductive arguments, you have inductive arguments, you have abductive arguments, but a lot of people aren't familiar with what are known as transcendental arguments. And this is not a distinctively Christian way of reasoning and arguing. It's as old as Aristotle, right? Aristotle employed transcendental arguments. Immanuel Kant, by no means a Christian, employed transcendental arguments. In fact, he has a whole book called The Transcendental Critique of Pure Reason, right? I'm not agreeing with, I'm not saying the conclusion of his argument was valid, but the form of argumentation, right? That method of argumentation has been employed. And it's the same sort of thing that Thaddeus was referring to when he made reference to Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism. He's arguing that on the conditions of atheism, man can't, we can't say that man knows anything, right? And I won't rehash what Thaddeus said on that. But, if you're going to argue against the notion that atheists are borrowing from somebody else's worldview, then you have to show how atheism can account for these things. You have to show, as Thaddeus was bringing up, how atheism can account for calling anything good or evil. If I say that I caught a fish this long, right, all of you are going to be wondering, well, that doesn't tell me anything. I need to put up another hand. There needs to be a reference point, right? Now you know how long the fish is, right? Without an ultimate reference point by which to measure or determine something to be good or evil, it makes no objective sense to call anything good or evil. And not just good and evil. The person you quoted, Thaddeus, said it doesn't adequately account for free will. Well, my goodness, has he read No Atheist Philosophers? Atheism logically entails a denial of free will. Yeah. Atheism is logically deterministic, So not only does atheism not account for making moral distinctions between good and evil, it also doesn't account for saying that man is not a mechanistically determined thing, right? It doesn't account for anything in the world.
In fairness, he just said the problem of free will. He could have meant it from the other angle, that he can't see how free will could exist. I'm not sure. He just said free will, so it's ambiguous.
External standard. Atheism lacks an external standard by which it can judge good and evil. How do you know that killing puppies is bad if you don't have an external standard that says so? I once ended up in a discussion with a devout atheist, and I'll say devout because he was very devout to his religion, and he said society makes these decisions. Because I think I might have asked him about pedophilia or something of that nature. And he says, no, society makes it. So, well, some societies have made the opposite decision. So how do you defend that? How do you say that, well, society, so in other words, it's whatever you want. In other words, it's will. It's not logos. There's no single external standard by which you judge. So therefore, it's entirely whatever you want to do. And besides, human will is fallible. Now, let's say even if I make a mistake, I can still be judged against the external standard. But an atheist, well, I felt like doing it today, so it's okay. Which in some also actually is, again, it goes back to Islam having a similar sort of idea in that you can, atheism is what you want to do and can get away with. And also, yeah, the moist robots idea. Sorry, Anthony made a very good point. In atheism, if there is no free will, I mean, you're just a moist robot. And Richard Dawkins makes this argument as well. He basically talks about that, there is no free will. We are simply just molecules bumping into each other and just brain activity. So in which case, Dawkins has no choice but to be an atheist. Unfortunately, that was his programming, and I've got mine, and I can't go against it, and he can't go against his. Unfortunately, he's not right, because it's just, well, yeah, he's got no free will, right? He has no choice but to be an atheist, and he's got no choice but to do what he doesn't think what he thinks.
Yeah, I've actually uploaded 2 videos of Richard Krauss and Richard Dawkins talking about free will, and both agree that there is no such free will. So that means everything is predicated on a chemical reaction in your brain as to what is right or what is wrong. So it's subjective. So it's merely subjective values which can differ in any one point in time or any one location in the world. But the problem I had when I was going through, if you like, evolution atheism at the time was, well, if I'm not told what is right or wrong, what is wrong, if I don't know what is right, what is wrong, then who am I in a position to stand condemning another person for the actions they take in their life course and what they do to others? That's just a natural form of reaction of the chemical processes that are taking, that are going on in someone's brain. The problem I have with atheists when they go down that road is that, who are you to criticize me for believing in God, when all I am doing is following the material chemical values that are taking place, that are processing in my brain, to come to a conclusion that there is an intelligent designer, which is what I, from your model, has evolved to do. So you're contradicting your own belief by telling me I'm wrong in doing what I believe, when I'm doing what I believe is actually in line with what your model teaches.
Yeah.
So I don't understand your argument. And not only that, why did evolution allow the process for the human brain? I mean, these are all arguments that just expand. But why did evolution allow the process in the human being brain to conceive of an abstract concept which is 180 degrees diametrically opposed to what evolution is? Why would evolution do that? Why would evolution be consciously aware that such a process could even be allowed in the first place? It just opens up another can of worms.
So Isaac did respond to my question about how he defines good and evil, and he said that he bases his foundation on well-being and cruelty. If we can agree on that foundation, what is evil to an atheist is dependent on that person. I'm more of a subjectivist. Two things I want to point out. One, well-being and cruelty, those are highly subjective terms. You've just removed the terms good and evil and put different terms in place. I mean, what is cruel? Is it cruel for a tiger to eat a zebra? Someone might say yes and someone might say no. I mean, you'll probably say no, but how is that inherently different than, a human being killing a tiger for sport? Well, maybe you'll say that's okay. Well, a lot of animals kill their own kind. Are you going to say that, well, that's fine for those animals, but it's not fine for human beings for some reason? So I really don't see what foundation you have. But saying that evil is subjective, that the individual decides what's evil and what isn't, is consistent with an atheist position. But here's the problem: there is no problem of evil if you're defining what evil is. If you're defining what's evil, then how can you look at God and say, why does he allow this evil to occur? Because someone else might have a different opinion of evil. You're saying that people shouldn't be allowed to have opinions about what evil is. So I think, when you take a subjectivist view, you've totally lost any argument. So in order to make it an actual argument from Christianity, you do indeed have to borrow an argument from Christianity about what evil is.
The thing is as well, so when you're talking about Christianity, it is an objective value system, because when you look at, say, something like 2 Timothy 3:16, which teaches all scriptures inspired God, beneficial for teaching, for reproving, for setting things straight. So when you break that down, beneficial for teaching, that'll be somebody that doesn't know what Christianity is. For reproving, that'll be giving correction to someone that's erred. And for setting things straight, that is, if there's a disagreement on, say, doctrine or attitude or a direction, you use the scripture to straighten that out. And then you've got another scripture, 1 Corinthians 4:6, which, I'll paraphrase, learn the rule, don't go beyond the things written. So it's a universal standard, whereas with evolution and atheists, it's merely regional. So one location where they're allowing other human beings to determine what is right and what is wrong, because that's what's locally determined by the majority, could well differ in 100 miles away or 1,000 miles away, that have a different set of standards or values. So when you do encounter each other, so from that moral value to that moral value, these two atheist groups, whose moral value are you then going to accept? Who's right or wrong then? And that's the difference between Christianity and theism, just on that principle alone.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on this morality issue? Well, let's first make a distinction that somehow atheists never seem to hear. No Christian ever would say that an atheist can't live what would be considered a moral life by a Christian standard. What we're arguing, though, is that following that standard is inconsistent with your worldview. I mean, why should you want to be a moral, quote unquote, moral person? Why should you want to do things that bring minor harm to you but benefit to others? Like, say, volunteering to help aid hungry people. That it's not a great amount of detriment to you, but it is some. You're giving up your time. So why should you do something like that? Or, in a much more extreme example, why should a person in, say, a war situation risk their own lives to save a friend's life? It doesn't make any sense in atheism from a purely naturalist perspective, from a purely logical perspective. You can say that we are biologically programmed to favor that, but can't you use your intellect to override your emotions? Can't you use your intellect and look at the situation and say, what brings me the most benefit is not the same thing that matches my biological moral conscience, so I should override that and just ignore my moral feelings.
Yeah.
Atheists don't really take into account the fact that they grew up, Western atheists at least grew up within a Christian worldview, in societies that were formed by Christian morals. And if you move to others, I've traveled extensively around the world, and if you go to other societies, they have different views of things. And, these non-Christian views are starkly different in some ways. So Christians don't appreciate the fact that their worldview of what's good and what's not cruel is based on the fact that they grew up around general Christian worldview or were influenced by those.
I wanted to point out, another assumption underlying the statement that he made. He mentioned that his criteria for determining good and evil is well-being or cruelty. What promotes well-being is good. What detracts from or goes against cruelty is good, and so forth. But there's an underlying assumption here that at least with respect to man, that there is a kind of dignity that man has, that we should want his well-being. We should not want to do things that are cruel towards him. Or even if you want to think more broadly of animals in general, you know, there's an ascription here of value to men and things that I don't find intelligible on atheism. Everything is just the end product of a mindless process acting on inchoate matter, right? Why should we value anything, whether man, animal, and so forth? Years ago, I had a conversation with a man, and he started the conversation, and I always like to remember how these conversations get started because it becomes relevant later, and in this case, it really does. But I was talking with this guy, and at one point in the conversation, he said, I don't want to talk anymore. He goes, let's finish this. And so I'm thinking in my head, wait a minute, you engaged me, right? You found out I was a Christian, and you thought that you were going to undermine my confidence in Christ and so forth. Now you don't want to talk anymore, right? Well, he said, I kept going, right? And so he said, look, he goes, just respect me enough to just drop it, right? Let's stop talking. And I said, okay. I said, I hear you. I said, as a Christian, I believe you're made in the image of God. And for that reason, I think you deserve respect. You have an inherent dignity about you. In fact, Peter, the Apostle Peter, tells us that the very thing that I'm doing right now is to be done with gentleness and with respect. I said, so I'm going to respect you and stop the conversation here. I said, but I wonder if you'll do me one favor. I said, I won't say anything more, but I'd really love to know from you, given what you've said so far in this discussion, why do you think I ought to respect you? I said, I'm not gonna reason, I'm not gonna argue against you. I'm not gonna do anything else. I just for my own sake, can you tell me why you think I ought to respect you? And so the guy sat there and he started thinking for a couple of minutes. I mean, literally, he's just sitting there thinking about it. And he had a friend that was like 15, 20 feet away. And he said, wait, can you repeat the question again? And I said, yeah, I want to know how you account for your assumption that I ought to respect you. Why do you as an atheist think I ought to respect you? And eventually he cried out to his friend and he said, hey, he says, Bob, come over here and help me account for myself. And at that point, I didn't have to say anything, right? He got the point. And lest it be lost on the listeners here, the point that I was making is that he was assuming his own dignity, even though he was espousing a worldview that was inimical to the very notion that he has any kind of inherent dignity about him. And so by the same token, I would ask, I think it was Isaac Anderson, why does he think that we ought to seek the well-being of other people, right? They're just a colossal accident. They're just the end product of the primordial ooze. Nobody gets upset when we walk down the street and jump in our kids jump in a puddle, right, and splatter water and mud all over the place, right? Why should you be upset when I do that to other, combination of bag of water, right, that you call human beings? Why can't I jump on them and splatter them all over the sidewalk?
Yeah, good question. Isaac said that if no person or being with authority to punish you, murdering would still be wrong. Well, we would agree with that from the Christian perspective. But again, where are you getting this from a naturalistic perspective?
Where's the atheist Bible that says that's wrong? Where's the external standard he's judging by, except his opinion? It's merely an opinion, and someone else can have a different opinion, and they can clash over it. Where is his external standard that says this is wrong? How does he know it's right? But what standard is he judging by? And what stops him from going to someone else, taking their stuff, because that makes his well-being improve?
Yeah, and he's equivocating there. Christians don't say that it's wrong because God will punish it. So if you remove the person who will punish you for it, therefore, it wouldn't cease to be wrong. We're saying God will punish it because it is wrong, and it's wrong because it violates his own character. And so, yeah, I think he's making a mistake there.
Yeah, I have to agree. You know, he said that it's been refuted that to make these kind of arguments you have to borrow from Christianity. But again, he himself said that he defines his own morality. So then what do you say to the person who says, I don't see any moral problem with killing another human being? What do you say to the society that defines certain types of killing that we would consider murder to be morally acceptable? For example, how would you respond to Islam saying that anyone who doesn't want to be a Muslim anymore deserves to be killed? You can't say that that is wrong from an atheist naturalistic perspective. All you can say is, I don't like that. But the people who practice that certainly believe it's morally right. Whether they believe in a God or not is irrelevant. They think it's right. And you said that morality is subjective, that it's defined on the personal level. So I think you really do have to borrow from something in order to get this idea that even murder is wrong.
That goes back to my point of view about where Christianity is universal and objective, whereas atheism is local and regional and subjective. So when one group of atheists that have certain moral values encounter another group of people that have certain moral values, and they differ, well, who's going to win and who's going to overcome who then? How do you resolve the dispute then? A Christian can go to somebody else in the world and use the Bible.
Well, the survival of the fittest.
That's it. Then you
right. Think if Group A kills Group B, they were the stronger one, they were the fitter one, they were right, they were morally correct. Correct.
Which goes back to then, yes, which means that they go back to the animal value of survival of the fittest, which they'll call natural selection, which is something that they won't want to do.
So in other words, Isaac Anderson is I don't know where he gets his morals from, but he doesn't want to harm people because you're a coward or because you've decided you like that part of Christian belief or because you don't have muscles. I don't know what it is, but there's no external standard by which you are judging. Because to atheism and Darwinism, the survival of the fittest, right? And if they kill you, well, they were right because you were weak, and that's it.
This is why I say atheists are the greatest hypocrites to walk the planet. They're the very ones who deny God or deny the Bible, they'll mock it, yet their very existence is predicated on Christian doctrine by proxy or some peculiar form of osmosis. Yeah. An example would be, why do atheists get married? That is a religious ceremony. It is based on religion. Why do atheists get married? Why do you go to a ceremony and have and perform a ceremony between you and a certain woman or a certain man, or man and man now? Because you see, atheists have no moral standard. You can pretty much do what you like. You can actually be born with a man, have the brain of a man, have the body of a man, have the genitalia of a man, but actually be called a woman. There is no level of depravity now or lifestyle that atheism doesn't seem to object to. You could be a 54-year-old man and sort of identify as a 6-year-old girl or a duck-billed platypus. There's no moral argument that you can go against now with atheists. So it's an open-ended, you can pretty much do what you like depending on the region that you live. And it reminds me of a discussion I had with Thaddeus, I think probably the first time that we met, when I would ask an atheist, how many different cocks do you want inside your daughter before you say enough's enough? How many different children do you want your daughter to have by different men before you say enough's enough? How many abortions do you want your daughter to have before you say enough is enough? How many sexually transmitted diseases do you want your daughter to have before you say enough is enough? Or would you like your daughter to meet that one man that looks after that one man, that gets married to that one man and has that one man's child? How absurd. You're mocking the very thing that we stand by, which is the very thing that you spend your time mocking, which is curious enough, because why is your whole existence predicated on mocking what other people believe? Surely what other people believe from a subjective point of view where there is no morality and it's all relative should not be relevant to you in the first place. After all, you're only here for maybe 30, 40, 50, 60 years, maybe less than that if you get coronavirus. Why spend your time arguing, your valuable time, because once you're gone permanently? Why spend it on YouTube arguing with theists? You have no dog in this fight. leave the chat. Go live your life with what's left.
Just one more comment on this, kind of moral critique, since I feel like we're starting to go a little bit in circles. Isaac says, because we understand that we have feelings and we are so advanced that we understand that I'm going to assume that means other people have feelings. I simply don't harm them, I'm assuming, because I would not want to harm someone else even for my benefit. And that's good. That we would call that a moral view. Most people would agree with that. But again, we're not talking about the ability to make moral decisions. We're not talking about the practice of atheists. I don't think that on average atheists are exceptionally immoral people. I think they're probably about exactly as immoral on average as a religious person. We're talking about the intellectual basis for declaring something is wrong, though. And I don't think you have an intellectual basis for doing so.
Yeah, and he's still assuming that man has some kind of inherent dignity. Why should somebody else's feelings matter, right? What is there about that person that matters, that their feelings matter? Why should I care, right? Why should I care that the next person's feelings are going to be hurt? Especially if I am going to be benefited. He said he wouldn't do it even if it was for his benefit. But why should the next person not want to, seek his own benefit? And he also made a point about there being no punishment for something. Ultimately, I did make the point that that's not the basis for saying something is wrong or not. That's the basis for the judgment. That's the basis for the punishment. But now consider the punishment element of this. If you're saying that your actions are not going to be any more rewarded than mine are going to be punished, then why should I care about somebody else's feelings if I could possibly benefit from them? Right? I mean, this doesn't, it collapses. It presupposes things that aren't true on atheism. It assumes that man has dignity. It assumes that his feelings matter. It assumes that I ought to consider his feelings as having some kind of relevance to my decision making, and it doesn't. On atheism.
Interestingly,
that's interesting, because what you're saying there, Anthony, kind of mirrors well with what Genesis 1:26 says when God is saying, "Let us make man in our image." So atheists don't recognize it, but they're actually reflecting God's qualities in the way that they look at other human beings. And Paul, the Apostle Paul, actually reinforces that in Romans 2:14, where he turns around and says, "For wherever people of the nations that do not have law, they do by nature the things of the law. These people, although not having law, are a law to themselves, because it's written on their heart." It is a part of the human being's psyche that, because we're made in God's image, that atheists, they don't actually recognize it, they don't realize it, but they're manifesting that godlike trait that God has put into the psyche and the DNA of human beings. It is not natural for you to turn around and say that this is something that evolution has produced. That is just diabolical. This is something that God has put in place in the psyche of human beings.
It's fascinating that he's using the argument from Fifis when I thought the atheists believe in science and only science, because I didn't see any scientific stuff. I saw Fifis there. I definitely saw that word. And then also he says the closest we have to an absolute is the golden rule, which do as you would be done by, which I'm pretty sure is biblical in nature. I wonder who said that. Let me ponder that for a second. We might come up with a name. So he's appealing to Christianity to defend. So he's borrowing from God. Didn't we say that earlier? I believe that was the case. And very interesting that he's got to use Christian ideas to support atheism and Christian morality to support atheism. It's just you do need to do some researching, and interesting.
And notice he says that societies where murder was considered wrong and murderers were punished outperformed and outlived those that wouldn't. Why should an atheist care that societies flourish and continue? You're going to die, right? The mortality rate is 1 per person, right? Every person who's born dies, right? If I can assume the uniformity of nature, which I can't on atheism, but we know that in the past, everybody that has been born dies, and we're going to die. Why do I care if society continues when I'm dead, right? If I'm an atheist, what is there about the human race that I need to care that it would continue and perpetuate itself? You're assuming human dignity. You're assuming that man is, contrary to atheism, a being that has some kind of inherent dignity, about him and so forth.
I would also just add that I'm not even sure this statement is actually true. It's kind of just an assumption. I mean, where's the evidence for that? We know that most of modern society is based on European Christian values, but that's because the Europeans conquered the other lands. It could be pure chance that their values are the ones that came to be favored. It doesn't really seem to have evidence to back this claim.
And notice they thrived by, at the cost of others, right? So they did the very opposite of what he was saying. He respects other people's feelings, even if it's not going to benefit him, right? But European culture, as you pointed out, has thrived even at the expense of other people's feelings to some degree, at least. So apparently, his philosophy is at cross purposes with itself.
The thing is, as well, he talks about that society flourishes where they punish murderers, but looking at it from the evolutionary point of view, that's actually totally wrong. Evolution is predicated on death and murder. Without death and murder and savagery, we wouldn't have got here in their model in the first place. So you need death, murder, and savagery and violence, because the whole of history from the evolutionary model is death, murder, savagery, and violence that got us here in the first place. So you should be grateful that death, murder, savagery, and violence continues, because that's part of the model that you claim that you believe in. You're contradicting your own model now.
Excellent. We're approaching 2 hours, so we'll wrap up shortly. If anyone has any pressing comments that they want to make, go ahead and put those in the chat. While you're doing that, I'm going to give each of my guests opportunity to close on a more positive note of why they think Christianity is superior to atheism. But before that, I did want to acknowledge Isaac's final comment here, where he says, "I guess I just don't know at this point, and I'll keep researching. Have a good day." And I'm going to treat that comment as genuine, and I appreciate that. That's what everyone should want to do. They should want to continue to think about their ideas, see if they really hold up to scrutiny, because I think we can all agree that what we want is to follow what is true, not just follow what fits our desires. So we'll go in the reverse order of the way I started things here. Lloyd, what are your top reasons for accepting Christianity, briefly, obviously, as opposed to atheism?
A couple of things. One, if you have a commitment to truth, you have a commitment to Logos, and God is truth. And you then have a very firm basis in wanting to know the facts. And often maybe truth is fuzzy, but at least you have a commitment to facts. And facts can give you that sort of clarity. And then also, I grew up in South Africa. I grew up around a lot of violence. I've seen a lot of violence. And this is not something that, I just realized this is not moral. It's not moral to be unnecessarily violent. I grew up in a violent culture, and I realized if these people had inherited or imbibed honest Christian values, respect for others, respect for themselves, and a willingness to really want to do better with their lives and treat others better, then that worldview is really present in Christianity. It built Europe. It raised Europe out of poverty. It raised Europe out of barbarity, and the rest of the world suffered, right? Because it decided to cling to its own older ideas, and I think vastly inferior ideas. If I look at Africa, I mean, until the arrival of Western ideas, they were very, very primitive in many ways. And the same with the rest of the world. We've been successful because we've been committed to the truth and committed to finding the best ways to do things. And also, living in the Middle East for 11 years, seeing the dysfunction there, also taught me how great. I just became grateful for my own society, my own civilization, and how good the West is, how well it treats people. To know, as someone said in the chat earlier, that the idea of the golden rule is only present within Christian belief. So many things that are universal today, or at least is accepted as universal are really just Christian ideas. They're not present in atheism, not present in Islam, they're not present in other beliefs, and these are worth promoting, these are worth defending, and these are worth teaching to others. So yeah, I've learned in many ways, and also the effect in my own life, just the very positive, powerful effect, taking me out of poverty, taking me out of violence, and I grew up with a lot of both, and the success that I've made out of my life, and so there's a gratitude as well. I feel a great sense of gratitude for what's happening in my life, the positivity, and that's something that I think we can all be a bit more grateful. And yeah, so maybe a bit of a ramble, but those are my thoughts. And I think that we've just created better lives, better civilizations, better families, better institutions, and we're not perfect, but we've certainly risen above all the other failed experiments.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. Anthony, what are your top reasons for being a Christian as opposed to an atheist specifically?
Yeah, that's a big question. I appreciate Lloyd was able to give us a brief synopsis. I'm hoping I can do so as well. But to me, this, I've already said, it's huge. There are far too many things that could be said here. One thing I would say is, in terms of my own conviction that Christianity is true, I started reading the Bible. I wasn't an atheist at the time. I didn't really have any thoughts regarding God or not God. I was, but I had a lot of time on my hands. I started reading the Bible. And as I read it, it spoke accurately to my condition. I realized that what it said about me was true. And I also realized that it presented the solution to my problem. Namely, that I was a sinner before God and desperately needed a savior. And the more I've studied Scripture, the more the fact of the Bible as the Word of God has impressed itself upon me. And here, I don't mean simply the Bible's claim to be the Word of God. That's not the point that I'm making. I'm not saying it's the Word of God because it says it is. But as one reads Scripture, and if you've listened to any of my talks, I always hope this comes through in those talks, even if I'm not specifically talking about the Bible being the Word of God, but just explaining what the Bible says. I'm always hoping that comes through loud and clear to people. The Bible is an incredible book, and everywhere shows the fingerprints of God upon it. And I couldn't possibly, lay all of that out right now, but I do think if people would read the Bible and hear what it says, then they'd come to a greater appreciation, at least, of what I'm talking about. But I think I'll just leave it at that, because I don't think. Well, actually, I'll say this. There's one of the things that people will sometimes say to me is, how can you know that Christianity is the truth as opposed to every other religion? Have you studied every other religion? And one of the ways I respond to that is by saying, if I'm looking for my keys, and let's say I live in a 5-bedroom house and I find them in the second room that I'm searching, I don't have to look in the other rooms to know that I found my keys, right? The fact that I have the keys and, and they work and so forth is itself an argument that they're not in the other rooms. And there's an illustration I remember hearing a long time ago where somebody said, if you're walking down a road and you come to a fork, you're trying to get to a destination you've never been, you come to a fork in the road and you want to know which way to go, and there's a bunch of people there, but all of them are dead except for one, which one would you ask? And the logical answer is you ask the only one who's alive. And when you look at the world's religions, the founders of the world's religions, they're all dead. The only one who's alive is Christ. And so, like the angel said at the tomb, why do you seek the living among the dead, right? Jesus isn't here, he's risen. So the only person in all of human history who actually demonstrated that he has the power of life and death, just take it as a claim, right? The only religion out there that claims that its founder has actually conquered death and has promised life to his followers, that the only religion out there like that is Christianity. And so it's the only one really that's even on the table for consideration. And it's considerations like this that are operative in my thinking when it comes to saying that Christianity is true. But obviously, there's a lot more that needs to be said in all of that.
Excellent. This goes along with what you were saying, and it'll feature in my answer a little bit as well. But I wanted to point out, since it was related to our comment from our atheist friend about, following the golden rule, Vilnius says, I think the bigger thing about Christianity is not the golden rule, but to love your enemies. And while I can't say that that's absolutely distinct of Christianity, I can say with confidence that it's at least very rare for a belief system to teach that kind of thing. That pretty much every belief system would say, yes, you should treat other people the way you want to be treated. But it's only Christianity that says you should treat your enemies much better than they deserve. Thunderous, what are your thoughts on why you're a Christian? You have the longest journey of any of us to Christianity, being starting in Islam and traveling through atheism to Christianity. So what is your perspective of why you're a Christian?
There either is a God or there isn't. And there is no evidence to suggest that there is no God. There is no evidence to suggest evolution is true, not even in the slightest. So through that principle of deduction, you have to come to which God or which book is telling the truth about God. And logic dictates, when you look at the historical content, the moral content, whatever attack you want to lay on the Bible always comes out trump. The most translated book in history, the most distributed book in history, the most read book in history. If you had to go to a court of law, the Bible stands up every time. And then it's a case of, well, of all these religions claiming to be, the ones to be professing God, it'd have to be the one that's linked to Jesus. So that's where it's a process of elimination. There either is the God or there isn't. The Bible is either telling the truth, the truth or not. Jesus is either telling the truth or he doesn't. So that you will eventually come down to Jesus. It has to go down that way, that Jesus was the way, the truth, and the life. And why do I stick with it? Well, I've read the book of Revelation. Christianity wins.
Excellent. I get the benefit of going last since this is my channel, so I can start by saying all of the above. And I would, this echoes what others said a little bit, but this is kind of my primary reason is twofold. One, that Christianity is actually unique among the world religions. That basically every religion teaches the same thing. If you try harder, you follow certain rules, you'll achieve your own salvation. You'll become either a better person in certain systems, or you'll achieve favor with the universe, or you'll go to heaven, whatever the case may be for that system. But essentially, it's the same thing. Do your own. Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Make yourself a better person. Here's some rules to follow to help you with that. Christianity is unique in that it teaches, that mankind cannot be good on their own accord. Even atheists want to argue that man can be good, even though, as we discussed, they don't have a basis for saying what is good. But everyone wants to be good, but only Christianity offers a real way to do that, because trying harder doesn't work. We can see that in society. So that's the kind of the practical answer of why Christianity, as opposed to any other religion. The other reason would be, just the evidence. There is abundant evidence that God exists. There's abundant evidence that everyone needs to explain. In my experience with atheists, at least the kind that like to argue on the internet, which obviously doesn't represent everyone, but is that they spend a lot of their energy arguing that atheism is the default position, so that if they can show one flaw in whatever you believe, then they win and atheism is true. But I don't think that that's a very good system to come up with actual objective truth. I think you need to take into account as much evidence as you can, weigh all that evidence, and determine what's true. And I think when you do that, one, you determine that there's a God that created the universe, that something exists, and everything that we observe has a cause. So the fact that the universe exists should have a cause as well. And then when you look at the attributes of the universe, you see intricate design, you see complexity, and you realize that this creation object can't just be a force. It has to be a personal being. It has to be something with intelligence. And then, so now you're at theism. And then you look at the evidence for Christianity, and you see that the Bible holds up to historical scrutiny, especially the key event of Christian history, the resurrection of Jesus, is the only thing that really accounts for the data when you really look at it from what I believe to be an objective standpoint. And that's why I'm a Christian, because the evidence suggests Christianity is true, and because Christianity offers real solutions to the problem of good and evil. So with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I think that this was a really productive chat. I think we had a lot of good discussion. I especially want to thank the atheists that joined us. I don't know if I should say this, but I'll say it anyway. The contrast between the atheists' engagement and the Muslim engagement when I talk about Islamic issues is light and day. The Muslims just want to sit around and call names and such, and I think that the people who engaged today, they brought a lot of good points. They allowed us to really illustrate why we believe that theism is superior and why Christianity is the truth. So thank you guys for joining us today, and may God bless you and have a great rest of your day. Be sure to check out all of my guest channels. The links to those are in the description box.
Take care, everyone.